Imagine this. You're sitting in an examination hall right now. The problem? You spent the past few days doing everything except studying. Maybe you were binge watching K-dramas, endlessly scrolling through social media, or enjoying a little too much quality time with your Marites friends. You know, tagay here, tagay there, tagay everywhere. You get the picture. The point is, you didn't crack open a single book. And now, here you are, staring at your exam paper, completely clueless. You know deep down, you're doomed to fail. But wait, the result of this exam will shape the trajectory of your academic journey. So of course, you want to pass. So with a miserable face, one that might already be your default, you glance at your seatmate, who happens to be the brightest star in class. And then, the thought crosses your mind. What if I just peek? Yes, you're contemplating cheating. Your inner voice whispers, if I don't cheat, I'll definitely fail. But if I do cheat, I might pass. Should I cheat? Is it right? What do I do? So what would you do in this situation? Press the green button to cheat or the red button to resist? Whatever your decision, it reflects the fascinating psychodynamics of personality. Or, in other words, how the id, the ego, and the superego interact. In my previous video, we discussed Freud's earlier model of the human mind, the topographical model, famously illustrated with the iceberg metaphor. This model described the mind as consisting of three levels: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. But as I mentioned, Freud didn't stop there. Later, he revised his model and introduced the psychodynamics of personality, also known as the structural model. Freud argued that our personality is shaped by the interactions of three distinct forces: the id, which is entirely housed in the unconscious, the ego, which is just free floating, and the superego, also free floating. Now, let me clarify. These aren't parts of the brain like the cerebrum or hypothalamus. Instead, think of them as forces or energies that work together or clash to shape who we are. But how do these forces operate? How do they interact? And how do they influence our personalities? Let's dive in. But before we do, here's a quick question for you. Did Freud originally use the terms id, ego, and superego in his structural model? A yes, B no. Comment your answer below and we'll reveal the truth later. Let's start with the id. The id is the part of our personality that exists entirely in the unconscious. It's where our primal drives and instincts reside. According to Freud, we're all driven by two types of instincts: eros and thanatos. Eros, or the life instinct, is what drives us to eat, drink, have sex, and basically do all the things that keep us alive, help us reproduce, and allow us to build good relationships and find happiness. Freud believed eros is fueled by something called libido, a kind of psychic energy we are all born with. On the other hand, we have thanatos, or the death instinct. This is where things get a little dark. Thanatos is what drives us toward destruction, death even. Now, hold on. You're probably thinking, do we really want to die or self-destruct? Well, think about it. Why do we go on dangerous rides, bungee jump, or chase risky adventures? Freud argued that this drive often gets redirected outward as aggression towards others, but sometimes it can be directed inward, leading to self-harm or even suicidal tendencies. Fortunately, in most cases, our eros or life instinct balances out this destructive drive. So, what's the takeaway? The id is that part of us that demands the immediate gratification of our desires, whether those desires come from eros or thanatos. When these desires are satisfied, we feel pleasure.
Oh, yeah.
And let me tell you, the id is all about pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Hungry? The id might say, eat now, no food and money, then just go steal some food. Angry at someone? The id might shout, go punch him now, bang his head now. Want sex? The id might suggest, go get laid now. You see, the id doesn't care about rules, norms, or consequences. It's like the rebel teenager of your personality, impulsive, selfish, and pleasure-driven. Still confused? Let me make it simple. Think of a baby, a 6-month-old or maybe a 1-year-old. When a baby is hungry, they cry loudly, even in the middle of the night when everyone is sound asleep. Does the baby care that mommy and daddy need rest? Nope. The baby only cares about its needs and pleasure. Why? Because a baby is all id. Got it? Because of this nature, Freud argued that the id operates on the pleasure principle. So whenever you hear the word id, just remember it's all about the pleasure principle. Now, while the id seeks nothing but instant pleasure, regardless of whether it's achieved the right way or the wrong way, there's another component of personality that encourages us to act in morally acceptable ways. But what is it? How does it come into play and works? Earlier, I mentioned how the baby is all id. However, as a baby grows up and interacts with caregivers, authority figures, and the larger society, he or she starts to develop the superego, another component of personality that represents the person's internalized moral standards. These standards are, of course, based on the societal rules, values, and ideals the child is exposed to. It's these internalized moral standards that shape a person's ideal self and moral compass, the two key aspects of the superego. Confused? Let me explain with an example. If a child is constantly taught not to steal, not to lie, and, just to be honest, then it's very likely that the value of honesty will become part of the child's internalized moral standard. This in turn shapes the child's ideal self, or who he or she wants to become, and the child's moral compass or conscience, or what he or she believes is right and wrong. Now, as honesty becomes part of the child's ideal self and moral compass, it's very likely that the child will strive to become someone who is always honest, never stealing or lying. Moreover, if the child ever thinks about being dishonest, like stealing or lying, he or she will probably feel guilty or uncomfortable because it goes against his or her sense of right and wrong, or simply put, his or her conscience. So here's the big takeaway. The superego operates on the moral principle, which is based on the moral standards we've learned from society. It functions as an internal guide or judge, encouraging us to act in morally acceptable ways and discouraging actions that conflict with these standards. So while the id might say, eat now, steal some food if needed, the superego will step in with, hold on, Part of my moral compass and ideal self is being honest and righteous. So I must be honest and righteous or I'll feel guilt and shame. As you can see, the id and superego are like two forces within our psyche, often in conflict or tension as they represent instinctual desires and moral constraints. Now, from all this, you might think that the id shouldn't dominate us because it would turn us into purely pleasure-seeking individuals. But what about the superego? While we might assume that being dominated by the superego is a good thing, Freud argued that an overactive superego can be just as problematic. If we're excessively controlled by the superego, we become overly fixated on moral standards. This can lead to perfectionism and obsessive pursuit of an ideal self or perfect self, something we could never truly attain because, let's face it, nobody's perfect. Inevitably, mistakes will happen, and when they do, even the smallest errors can trigger overwhelming feelings of guilt and shame. This can lead to severe anxiety, depression, burnout, and other psychological struggles. So, the key point is that both the demands of the id and the superego need to be regulated. We don't want the id to overwhelm us, but we also don't want the superego to take over either. A balance is needed to maintain a psychologically healthy life. But what regulates the demands of the id and the superego? Well, this is where the ego comes in. The component of personality that looks into and is aware of the constraints of the reality. But how does the ego regulate the id and the superego? Let's break it down. To understand how the ego works its magic, let's first look at how it keeps the id in check. As mentioned earlier, the ego is aware of the constraints of reality. It understands that there are norms, rules, and laws in society, and there are consequences to our actions. So, when the id is screaming, "Eat now, steal some food if needed," the ego actually steps in and says, "Hold up, I can't just do that. There are rules and consequences. If I steal, I might get caught, get punched, or worse, I could go to jail." The point is, the ego takes reality into account before making any decisions or taking action based on the id's demands. In other words, the ego acts as the moderator between the desires of the id and the constraints of reality. Still a little confused about how the ego works and checks the id? Let's use an analogy that Freud himself used. Freud likened the id to an impulsive horse, and the ego to the horse rider. According to Freud, the ego controls the id just like how the rider controls the impulses of a horse. Did that make sense? I hope so. Now, what about the superego? Well, the ego handles the superego the same way it handles the id. Let's say the superego demands, "Hey, ask the owner for permission before eating that food, otherwise it will be a form of stealing and that's bad." The ego might think, "If I don't eat right now, I will surely pass out, which could be dangerous for me. Maybe I can just eat it now, explain the situation to the owner later, and find ways to settle the score." So as you can see, the ego moderates between the demands of the superego and the constraints of reality, ensuring that the superego's moral expectations aren't so overwhelming or unrealistic that they cause danger or emotional distress or prevent us from functioning effectively. In general, the ego serves as the mediator between the often competing demands of the id and the superego. It's the ego that ensures we can satisfy the demands of the id without violating the moral boundaries set by the superego. And it does this by accounting for the reality. This is why Freud said that the ego is guided by the reality principle. To give you one example showing how the ego mediates the id and the superego, or how these three forces interact, let's go back to the scenario earlier. The one where you're taking an exam and thinking about cheating just to pass. In this situation, the small boy is telling you to do whatever it takes to pass the exam, be it through cheating, is the id. The boy is telling you to do the right thing, don't cheat because it's morally wrong, is the superego. Now, your decision and course of action will show how your ego mediated between the demands of the id, the superego, and the constraints of reality. Here's one possible way your ego might have handled it. Alright, let's think this through. The id wants me to pass at any cost, but the superego says I should do it the right way. The school has strict policy against cheating and my teacher is keeping an eye on me. If I get caught, I'll face consequences. So here's what I'll do. I won't cheat. I'll talk to my teacher later and see if I can take a makeup exam. This way, I can satisfy my id without going against my superego. In this example, the ego weighed the demands of the id and superego, considered the reality of the situation, and made the best decision based on all the variables. So, that's how the ego works, balancing the needs of the id and the superego with the reality of the world around us. Now back to our question. Did Freud use the terms id, ego, and superego in his structural model? A. Yes. B. No. And the answer is no. Wait, how come? Well, Freud was actually German and he wrote his works in German. So the exact terms he used to describe the psychodynamics of personality were in German. He specifically used the terms in the first column, which literally translates to the it, the I, and the Oberei or above I. The terms id, ego, and superego were chosen by Freud's English translators, notably James Strachey, to give the terms a more scientific and universal feel. The terms were actually adapted from Latin. As per why Freud used the said terms to describe the three components of personality, it's pretty straightforward and relational. Once you grasp Freud's psychodynamics of personality, that is. And of course, Freud's work wouldn't be complete without talking about the stages of psychosexual development. But that's a topic for next video. So, see you there.